Today, I am sitting down to have a conversation with Sue, who is an amazing author on Amazon who has been publishing for almost a year now. We met about a year ago when she took my program. And she has since become very profitable, has become a bestseller in romance categories. And we are going to be talking today about the importance of blurbs, about description writing, because of course everyone's saying how important blurbs are and they have to be really good, but what exactly does that mean? So hi, Sue.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Yeah, so you have chilly Chicago in your background.
I do. It's freaking brutal here.
Yeah, but you're gonna escape soon, so that's good. So let's get right into it. So tell us all a little bit about your journey, especially over the past year, as you've embarked on your publishing with Amazon,
Mhm.
and tell us how it's been and what your path looked like in becoming a profitable and best-selling author.
Yeah, it's been fun. I can't believe it's been a year though. That's just crazy. Like, I think initially it was a lot more confusion and then overwhelm and everything, and it still comes and goes. But now I've gotten the hang of doing the basic. Like me, I like to experiment a lot, like with my covers and the tropes that I'm using, and all of those things. But I've just found my sweet spot now with a combination that I know works for my readers specifically. So I think I'm at a much better place than I was, say, 8 months ago.
Awesome. And so when you first started out publishing, you didn't know anything about writing descriptions. Like you had no idea what
I
that was about,
didn't. I
right?
didn't. And the funny thing is, I didn't even know, obviously, right? Like a lot of people don't know that the amount of research that goes into covers and blurbs and all of those things that are the first thing that people see when they like look at your product page, right? And so I didn't know the extensive amount of research that you have to do
Mm-hmm.
to get that right. And once I did start doing all of those things, it still took me a while to become good at it. Like I remember I used to, I mean, you know this, right? Like I used to take like 2 weeks to write one blurb for my book because I would go over it like every single day, bit by bit, and just improvising it. Um, so I did that. Like I used to publish one book a month, and so each blurb would take me like 2 weeks. I was super involved in the cover process, like finding the image. I'm very particular about those things, even though they might not seem that important, and you just outsource um, these things. But I just knew from the beginning that I had to um, put my complete attention into
Mm-hmm.
all of these things that are essentially the first things that people see, right?
For sure. And that's one thing I really noticed about you is you were so focused on the blurb writing and the descriptions, and you dove deep into like how you can improve your blurb. And you would do like so many different iterations of your blurbs, which was really, really awesome. You become so good at it. So
Yeah.
why are blurbs descriptions? For those of you who don't know, blurbs descriptions, we use that interchangeably. It's what's showing up on your product page in Amazon. So why are blurbs so important and powerful?
I think with blurbs, like we call them blurbs for fiction. Like nonfiction people are like,
Mm-hmm.
no, they're book descriptions.
Yes, yes,
But yeah,
exactly.
so for blurbs, I think more than the the actual like plot or the actual story, I think uh, the use of a blurb is to kind of pull the reader in emotionally and give them a taste of what they're going to feel when they read the book. Like it's not about the actual story, but it still has to convey what exactly the story is about without going too much in detail about the plot points and a particular scene or whatever. So um, it's just like a little bit of like a starting point for the readers to see what the book is going to be about.
Mm-hmm.
But it still has to be done in a way that doesn't, I mean, you have to make the most of that little space, right? And so you can't just put anything there. It has to be emotional, and because it's romance at the end of the day too, right? So, and I think that's common in most of the romance genres, not just contemporary or paranormal. Like every genre has its own way of going about this, but the main idea is to focus on the emotions and the tropes. So when you combine the two, you know exactly what the book is going to be about without going too much into detail. Does that make sense? I think
Oh,
I was like all over
absolutely.
the place,
Yeah.
maybe.
Can you give us, what are a few qualities that you can think of off the top of your head of a really good high converting blurb?
Hmm. So I think the first thing that people notice, obviously, is the headline, right? And it has to have a little bit of shock factor or a lot of shock factor,
Yes.
depending on what the book is about. So it has to be very eye-catching, and I prefer to use one of the trending tropes in the headline. And it depends what what kind of book it is. Like for dark romance, I love writing dark romance. I don't publish dark romance, but the blurbs are just so emotional and poetic. So it depends on what the genre is. And but definitely I definitely try to use 99% of the time some trending trope in the headline and give it like a bit of a shock factor. So that I think is really important. Very strategically placing all the tropes within the blurb, without going too much into detail, and just picking and choosing what you would like to include and what you the hardest actually, the funny thing is it's hard to make it shorter. So when people see blurbs that are like 120 words or whatever, right, like it doesn't seem like a lot of work, but it's easier to write a blurb that's longer. And
Definitely.
it's harder to shorten it. So
Mm-hmm.
I think the challenge for a lot of people sometimes is to know what are the things that they need to exclude. And whenever I see rough drafts of people, of blurbs from people, right? So I mean, there's a lot of things that just don't serve any purpose. Like they're entertaining, but it's just like a waste of space.
Mm-hmm.
So I think keeping it short is really important, and obviously including all of the trending tropes in there strategically. It can't just you can't just throw them out, and if they don't look natural, like basically, I don't know. It kind of sounds cliche, but it helps to read the blurb out loud, because it kind of has to sound a little bit like music. Like you don't want to have like any awkward things here and there that just sound awkward when you say it out loud.
Mm-hmm.
So it needs to be short, snappy, but it has to sound natural, like when you're
Yes.
saying it out loud. And obviously I always end blurbs with a cliffhanger.
Yes,
So
definitely.
that I think is the hardest part of it, because I don't like to sound cliche, like, oh, like what's gonna happen, like what's gonna happen next or whatever, right? But I don't want to sound cliche, so that takes me the most amount of time to end the blurb with a really nice cliffhanger that makes the reader want to actually go ahead and buy the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
Also, one of the things is, oh, I forgot what I was going to say. Yeah, so for romance, I've noticed that with blurbs, the whole point of it is to show the reader the conflict, right? The conflict, like why these two people, they want to be together and they should be together, but they just cannot be together. So once you show that effectively, the reader wants to get the book and find out how they do actually overcome these obstacles, right? So it's not just about like, oh, I like him so much, I like her so much. No, it's also that I like her, but there's just no way that we can be together, and this is the reason why. And so the reader wants to know that, how they overcame that obstacle and how they did get together.
Those are all such great, important points. What you're just talking about at the end about the conflict, like that is
Mhm.
so key. Like focusing on conflict,
Mhm.
characterization, and tropes in the blurb. And yeah, there's so much gold in what you just shared there. So I hope people will watch that a few times to really get all of those points. One thing that I would add in there too, as well, when you're talking about headlines, is when you go and look at a product page, you'll notice that there's some of the blurb is visible, what we call above the fold. The actual reader has to click on read more to read more. So you need to maximize that space at the top of in the headline where the reader is able to see that without clicking on read more. Because we have such a short opportunity to grab someone's focus and attention. They need to maximize that. It's like super valuable real estate. That's awesome. Thanks, Sue. Let's see, what else did I want to ask you here? Oh, yes. So talking about being short and being concise, in your opinion, what is the ideal length for a blurb? And I mean, we're talking mostly about romance here, right? So
yeah, I would say anything below 150 words is ideal. I like to do below 130.
Awesome.
And I've written I used to write blurbs that were like 200, 250 words, and they were just horrible. Like they were horrible. Right, now when I go back and read my like previous work, like it's just, it was just like such unnecessary information and so long. But I definitely try to the people that I work with, I definitely try to keep their blurbs shorter than 130 words.
Right. Oh, that's awesome. You know, when we were working together, I guess half a year ago, when I was helping you with your process and writing blurbs, I'd always, be like, make it shorter, more concise, less wordy, and which is so common. Like that is such a common thing when people are starting to really focus on improving blurbs.
Yeah.
And so, what, in your opinion, what is the best point of view for a blurb in romance? First person or third person?
I'm sorry, what?
What's the best point of view for the blurb? First person or third person, and why?
I've seen both kind work really well, but I do first person. I think it's easier to pull the reader in when it's in the first person. It just sounds like you're talking to the person in the book, right? So I definitely think that first person is more it's more effective. And also I prefer to do present instead of past.
Yes.
And sometimes I do a hybrid depending on what the story is. Like if I have to like talk about the past and then the present, that's fine too. But ideally I would like to do first person present because I think that's way more intimate.
I agree. And also, even if the book is written in third person, you can still do a first person blurb.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is important to know, because some people are like, oh, but my book's in third person. It's like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Take the point of view of one of those characters and just dive deep with that. And, bring the blurb from that perspective. And consistency is super important. I've seen some people when I'm giving feedback on blurbs, some people will come with a blurb where the headline is in first person and the rest of the blurb is in third person. And it's not effective. You have to keep that perspective consistent throughout the blurb. And present, like you're saying, having that first person present is super effective too. Again, we're always looking at how to emotionally affect the reader, and that can be super powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I don't know what you're going to come up with for this next question, but can you give us a formula for a winning blurb?
A formula.
Whatever that looks like to you. A formula for a winning blurb.
Like the process of creating it, or like what exactly it should look like? What do you mean?
How about both? The process and then what it should look like at the end. What is that formula for a winning blurb?
The reason why I think my blurbs work well, like mine in specific, not the ones that I do for other people, mine in specific, because just the way I plan them is that I have a blurb before I have a book. So I construct I pick my tropes depending on what I want the blurb to look like. It's kind of like backwards a little bit.
That's really cool though. That's awesome.
So I know the conflict that I want to focus on in the blurb. And also I feel like this is so important because I'm like, I would use my blurb for my Facebook ads, right? And those cost so much money. And so I want to plan everything that revolves around my ads and my product page and everything. So I pick the tropes depending on what I want the blurb to look like. And that's the first step. It changes while the book is, being written and all of those things. It does change depending on what I feel the book is sounding like. but that gives me a really good starting point. Yeah, I think I've covered like a majority of it. I can't think of anything specific on
And so
this
we talked
one.
about the length. It should be kind of shorter. Well, it should be shorter, not kind of shorter. It needs to be short. We have
Yeah.
only a small window of attention for from readers. Another
Mm-hmm.
thing is the actual appearance of the blurb. I'm sure you probably agree with this, that it should not be block paragraph. I guess depends on,
Oh, yes, yes,
but
yes.
it's
I
like
forgot that one.
giving some spaciousness, having line by line, having sentences,
Mhm.
making it easier for the reader to read down the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's your take
Um,
on that?
yeah, I definitely think that it needs to look like poetry, even if it's not a poem.
Sure.
It needs to read like that. It's
Yeah.
basically like, how we write emails, like the kind of emails that I get from you, right? Say, it's like one line after the next after it. Like people don't like to read like blocks and
No, it's
lines, but
hard.
it's just easier for your eyes to scan
Yeah.
through one line after the next.
It almost causes this like stress response in the body when you like get an email or you have to like, look at something and it's a big paragraph of text.
Yeah, yeah. I don't read those emails, and I don't read those blurbs either,
No, I totally
So
agree. Or if I
so
do have to read those blurbs, I'm just skimming. So why not do the work for the reader and make it so it's more, you know,
yeah. I mean,
consumable?
honestly, I have noticed like a lot of blurbs that are written in that way and that are doing very well,
Mhm.
even in contemporary. But I also think that a lot of those authors are like really, really established, right? And their
Yes.
fan base is so loyal
Hmm.
that regardless of like what their blurb looks like, people will buy their books, right? Um,
Absolutely.
so there's like you have to know what like who you want to take inspiration from. Um,
Mhm.
some people are at the level in their careers where they don't have to care as much about all of these things that we're talking about, just because they have such a loyal readership. And but I definitely want to follow, especially at this point, because I think my formula is working well for me. So um, I definitely follow things that are like easier on the reader,
Hmm.
and it's just like it's something that I would read too. So
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So what are the biggest mistakes that you see authors making when it comes to their blurbs?
hmm, it can just go on and on about this
Oh,
one.
I know, but it's like, what are maybe do the top three mistakes you see authors making with their blurbs?
Top three. I think number one would be excess information. Um, Excess information and not going into the conflict. And just basically like they would take a scene and just deconstruct it in the blurb when it's not necessary. It's just like those little plot points that don't need to be in there. And they don't serve any purpose. Like they're not showing the conflict. They're not like emotionally that effective. And they're just taking up space. So I think like cutting that out is the one thing that I would definitely recommend to everyone. And it takes practice, like nothing is it took me a very long time. It took me a very long time. I thought my blurbs were amazing, but they weren't. um, Another thing I noticed is with the headlines, a lot of times people don't like people would say something like, oh, so, and I remember I did this too. Oh, so what is the difference between this and this, or something like that? That has nothing to do with like the characters. Has nothing to do with the tropes. It's just random,
Hmm.
just because I thought like it just sounds nice.
Right.
So, and I feel like nothing in your blurbs or anything that you basically copyright, right? Like nothing can be random. There
Hmm.
has to be like a reason behind every word that's in there. So for the headline, nothing to abstract. Um, it has to do with um, you know a trope or a conflict that's revolving around the trope. And I think
Hmm.
that just naturally like gives you that shock factor that a
Hmm.
headline needs.
Hmm.
My third thing, My third thing would be, yeah, like I said, I read each blurb out loud a lot of times. And I notice that whenever I'm like, someone sends me a rough draft, it just sounds awkward when I read it.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense, but it's not, this is kind of hard to explain, but it just sounds awkward when you read the whole thing, So, and I think this comes with practice too. Like when you've written enough blurbs and then you just know that this one is like awkward sounding and this one is not. It's just the overall presentation that I think is really important.
Yes, I agree with all those things. Another thing I would kind of emphasize is um, I see people trying to tell too much of their story in the blurb. Again, that comes into what you're saying about excess information. Like it's not necessary. You shouldn't be hitting every plot point in the description.
Yeah.
And also, not only with blurs, but also with the covers, with the titles, not focusing and highlighting the trending tropes in those areas, and makes that the books look too generic, and it's going to be really hard to attract a big audience if you're not really focusing in on the tropes. So those are just my 2 cents with mistakes there.
Yeah. And also, like a lot of like I do a lot of tropes for each one of my books. I have at least like 5 or 6 of them going at one time, and it's just crazy. And so fitting all of those into like a 130 word blurb is a challenge because there's just so much that you want to cover. So I think that's one of the challenges that I did have to overcome, like finding that formula that worked for me. I knew I wanted to include like a lot of, because I wanted to target different kinds of markets, right, at one time. And so just fitting all of that in and doing it naturally where it doesn't feel like I'm just like throwing information out there was a challenge for me, for sure.
So when you look back to your blurb writing a year ago, how has it evolved, and what advice would you give that past self?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I have to think about this. My past self, I think I was doing my research and I didn't know who to research. I think at that point, I was doing the wrong kind of research. But I do think that I was now, I kind of take the good parts from all the genres that I see, and I create my own instead of just focusing on contemporary. I want to take the best practices from like all the genres, and that's something that I didn't do before. Like I was too occupied with just contemporary because that's what I was doing, and that's what I'm still doing. But there's good things that I can like borrow from the other niches that I didn't before. So that definitely broadened my horizon and made me better. So that is something that I would tell my past self for sure.
Awesome. So you've been more resourceful, essentially. You've like reached out further and gathered more data and experimented a little bit more.
Yeah, and I have done so much experimentation. Like, you remember, right? Like this one time I took a book and I kind of like pulled it apart. It was a romantic comedy and I took so many notes on the back matter, the front matter, like everything, like the tropes, the midpoint, everything. Like that's just me. So I think that's helped a lot. That doing these kinds of things that have those things have helped a lot. So I think I would probably ask myself to start doing them right away. My past self.
To start doing which? Sorry.
Like just start taking from like other niches and just best practice. I think that kind of gives you an edge too.
For sure.
Instead of just ignoring the valuable information that's right in front of you, right? So I think that is what's given me an edge, like a little bit.
That's great advice. Yeah, thanks so much. So any last words on blurbs before we end the interview?
It looks easy, but it's a little tricky.
Yes.
And, it's what helps me a lot is that I test my blurbs with Facebook ads, and that just that makes a lot of difference. I know a lot of people who are doing that, and that's the one thing that's going to be your ad copy, right? In your ads. And apart from the, like, it's basically like if you're sending a lot of traffic to your product page and it's people are not buying, there can only be two reasons, right? Your cover or your blurb.
Totally.
So I think it's worth putting your time and effort into learning for sure. And I see a lot of people who are doing that, you know, like who are where I was a year ago when I was like, okay, I used to take like 2 weeks to write one blurb, right? And I see a lot of people that are doing that now, and that's awesome. I think it's more like it's really important to let people know how important it is.
Definitely. Blurbs are so important, as you just mentioned about Facebook ads. As soon as you start sending paid advertisement to your book, you have to be sure that everything on that product page is totally dialed in and top notch. And your blurb is a huge, huge part of what's going to convert someone from just an interested like reader to an actual buyer. So blurbs are, if you're going to be doing paid advertising, you need to focus on getting the most effective blurbs possible. And so, Sue, thank you so much for everything you've shared with us. This has been so valuable, and so happy for all the success you've had. And the good news is that you can have Sue write your blurbs for you. So this is an amazing service that she's now sharing. If you're interested in getting Sue to help you with your blurbs, there's going to be some contact information for her down below in the description. Or if you're watching this on Facebook, it'll be in a comment. Yeah, get in touch with her and have her help you with your blurbs. If this is not your cup of tea, if you aren't, really dedicated to diving in deep and doing all the research and executing all this on your own, there is help. Sue can absolutely help you with this. And I've seen the blurbs that she's been doing for other people. And they are stellar. They're so good. So you're in good hands when it comes to Sue. So thanks again, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Helpful for people. Yeah, it was great catching up with you. And we'll talk to you again sometime soon.
All right. Keep in touch.
Bye.